On the 3rd of January 1868, a coup occurred in Japan when a group of reformers seized power in the name of the Emperor Meiji. The Meiji Restoration toppled the Tokugawa Shogunate that had ruled Japan for 265 years. Following it, Japan entered into a remarkable period of technological development and modernization. The Meiji Restoration raises a vital question about the history of Imperial Japan. Had the emperors been figureheads for much of Japanese history, overshadowed by the shoguns and warlords, or was there a time prior to the Tokugawa Shogunate when they exercised real power? This is the story of the emperors of Japan and the Japanese archipelago's unique imperial system. Japan's imperial history is unlike that of virtually every other country in the world. Most countries that have had royal or imperial systems have had dynasties that came and went every few hundred years. For instance, in England, the Tudor dynasty ruled the country between 1485 and 1603, before the Stuarts succeeded. Then the House of Hanover inherited the throne in 1714. France had three main dynasties between the 10th century and the French Revolution of 1789, the houses of Capet, Valois, and Bourbon. Closer to Japan, China's millennia-long imperial history, down to 1911, is divided up into dynastic eras as ruling family lineages like the Han, Tang, Ming, and Qing ruled one of the world's largest and most enduring nations for hundreds of years at a time. Japan was different. Although emperors have ruled Japan for at least 1,500 years, the country has not had distinct dynasties. Traditional Japanese succession practices do not recognize familial distinctions, instead considering the emperors to be quasi-divine persons who rule outside of the traditional bonds of family succession. Therefore, when historians have sought to divide up the imperial history of Japan, they generally do so according to distinct periods or eras that were characterized by specific political and socio-cultural developments. For instance, the era between 538 AD and 710 AD is known as the Asuka period, because the imperial capital was Asuka during this time. This was followed by the Nara period, which dominated the 8th century and is so named because the imperial capital was moved to Nara. Only at the end of the 8th century was the imperial capital moved to the city with which the emperors are most closely associated today, Kyoto. This initiated the long-running Heian period in the process. To confuse the situation further, in later centuries, the emperors became ceremonial figures within Japan's politics, and real political power was concentrated in the hands of either powerful clans like the Fujiwara, or later by the shoguns of the Tokugawa clan between 1603 and 1868. This, in turn, has led to some periods of Japanese history being named after the shoguns and warlords, rather than the emperors. For instance, the period between the rise to power of the first Tokugawa shogun in 1603 and the Meiji Restoration in 1868 is called either the Tokugawa Shogunate or the Edo period, Edo being the name for the city of Tokyo at the time, from which the shoguns ruled Japan, with the emperors becoming ceremonial figureheads throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. Thus, Japan's imperial history is unique. Nobody can really be sure when the first emperors of Japan came to power. Legend has it that the first Japanese imperial ruler was Emperor Jimmu. The oldest Japanese histories ever written, books like the Nihon Shoki or Chronicles of Japan, claim that he ruled over a large part of the Japanese archipelago in the middle of the 7th century BC, and that there is an unbroken chain of emperors that have ruled Japan in the more than 2,600 years since then. However, most historians and Japanese scholars today consider Jimmu and many of his alleged near successors to be mythical characters who were invented hundreds of years later by Japanese writers. This would not be unique. For instance, the Roman Empire had elaborate origin myths which suggested that Romulus and Remus, the twin sons of Mars, the god of war, founded Rome. The Xia dynasty that supposedly united China into an empire for the first time around 2000 BC is now understood to have been little more than a literary construct, and that Eastern China was only united for the first time well into the 2nd millennium BC. Similarly, Jimmu was a mythical or legendary figure. In reality, in the 1st millennium BC and into the early 1st millennium AD, the islands of the Japanese archipelago were divided into different kingdoms and polities that were substantially behind mainland Asia in their level of technological and cultural development. It was only gradually between 500 BC and 200 AD that Japan moved swiftly through the Bronze and Iron Ages as new technologies and cultural ideas were transferred from China and Korea to the Japanese islands. The imperial system would begin to emerge soon after. The emergence of the imperial system and the beginning of the dynastic era of Japanese history must be considered in the light of China's influence over Japan. While Japan's culture was still relatively underdeveloped in the 2nd and 1st millennia BC, China had already emerged as one of the foremost centers of civilization found anywhere in the world. Great states based on extensive agriculture along the Yangtze, Yellow, and Pearl rivers had come into existence, and these were finally united into a unified kingdom by the Qin dynasty in the late 3rd century BC. By then, Confucianism as a philosophical and quasi-religious system had emerged. Some of the classics of Chinese literature were being written down, and there was considerable technological progress. Before too long, the Chinese were expanding outwards and began to influence places like Korea, Indochina, and then the islands of the Japanese archipelago. By the middle of the 1st millennium AD, both Buddhism and Confucianism had been introduced into Japan from the mainland, while everything from advanced methods of cultivating rice to the kanji writing system would also be brought to the Japanese islands by the Chinese in this era. In Japan, these cultural influences took on their own particular native characteristics. The introduction of Chinese systems was important in shaping the evolution of the Japanese imperial system. It allowed for more powerful bureaucracies to build up greater state power in Japan, and this, in turn, ensured that a man could emerge who could claim to rule over all of Japan. Indeed, the very concept of an emperor exercising imperial power from a secretive palace was adopted wholesale from the Chinese. As with so much of early Japanese imperial history, what we are witnessing is the transplantation of Chinese systems to the islands and then the evolution of an idiosyncratic Japanese version of them over hundreds of years. The period of Japanese history that began as these Chinese influences spread is known as the Yamato period. This began around 250 AD, though there is no real consensus amongst historians as to the exact start date of it. Some scholars trace it back hundreds of years earlier. It lasted down to 710 AD, and is so named because a series of kings or emperors during this time exercised control over the Yamato region of central Honshu, the largest island of the Japanese archipelago. They later expanded their power outwards to control over half of the islands, but the process of full unification of Japan under imperial rule was a slow process. Generally speaking, the Yamato period is subdivided into two distinct periods: the Kofun period, which lasted down to 538 AD, and the Asuka period between 538 AD and 710 AD. These names are in turn derived from the distinct parts of the Yamato region where the royal capital stood during these times. However, during the Kofun period, we are still dealing with regional rulers and kings. It was only with the start of the Asuka period that we can speak of Japan's first historically attested emperor, the Emperor Kinmei. Kinmei was born early in the 6th century AD. As we have seen, there is an argument that there had been emperors of Japan that ruled over parts of Honshu for hundreds of years already by this time. While a large proportion of these earlier emperors are broadly mythological individuals in the same vein as King Arthur in Britain or Gilgamesh in Mesopotamian lore, there is more concrete evidence to support the existence of later rulers in Japan. For example, there is archaeological evidence for the existence of a mid-5th century AD ruler by the name of Urayaku. According to the Kojiki, or Records of Ancient Matters, a genealogical account of the earliest emperors that was compiled in the 7th and 8th centuries AD, Urayaku was the 21st emperor. However, just because there is evidence to support the historical existence of a local ruler in the Yamato region named Urayaku around 460 AD, this does not mean that he was an emperor. Instead, the impression from the available evidence is of an evolving set of local rulers in the Yamato region who gradually became more powerful in the Kofun period. Then, in the middle of the 6th century, Kinmei elevated the status of these rulers to that of emperors, perhaps in line with imported ideas of Chinese imperial rule. For this reason, many studies argue that Kinmei's reign is the first of the true emperors of Japan, though in the emperor lists derived from the Kojiki and other ancient chronicle histories, he is the 29th emperor. His reign from the late 530s AD to the start of the 570s AD cemented the establishment of Asuka in the Nara prefecture as the early imperial capital. This is approximately 60 kilometers south of Kyoto, the more well-known imperial capital. The archaeological remains of several palaces at Asuka dating to the 6th and 7th centuries AD attest to the site's position as the imperial capital. There were 15 different imperial rulers during the Asuka period, according to the traditional lists, that is over a period of approximately 170 years between Kinmei's reign and 710 AD, when the Asuka period came to an end and the capital was moved to Nara. These rulers were far from being all-powerful rulers of Japan. Their dominion continued to be restricted to Honshu, and even the more northerly parts of the island were not under effective imperial control. Hence, a unitary Japanese state was growing rather than fully established during the Asuka period. This was compounded by civil conflict over the introduction of new ideas from the Asian mainland. During the Emperor Kinmei's reign, the Soga clan had acquired power and influence at the burgeoning imperial court. They soon entered into a major conflict with the Mononobe clan. The issue was over the introduction of Buddhism into Japan. The Soga clan favored the new religion, while the Mononobe clan continued to adhere to Japan's traditional religion, Shintoism, a polytheistic animist religion. The Soga-Mononobe conflict dominated Japan's politics during Kinmei's reign and beyond. A further striking feature of the Asuka period is that male rule was not guaranteed during it. In 593 AD, a daughter of Kinmei ascended as Empress Suiko, the first empress regnant in Japanese history. Her reign of 35 years was the longest of any female ruler in Japanese history. She was also the first of 6 empress regnants during the Asuka period. For a society that would come to lay an especial emphasis on male rule in later centuries, the Asuka period is striking for the number of female empresses who ruled directly, not just as consorts. The Empress Suiko was given this name posthumously. Japan has an unusual imperial naming system. though as with so much else about its early history, this was acquired from China and then evolved to have some idiosyncratic Japanese elements. Typically speaking, an emperor or the few empresses of Japanese imperial history had a personal name when they were born. So, to take the example of Emperor Bidatsu, the second of the Asuka period emperors, he succeeded Kinmei around 571 or 572 AD. The Nihon Shoki, or Chronicles of Japan, one of the oldest Japanese historical texts, indicates that his personal name was Nunakura no Futu Tamashiki. Instead, the name Bidatsu was the era name given to his reign after his death. Typically speaking, while they were actually ruling, the emperors were referred to as Tennoheika, meaning His Majesty the Emperor, although this usage had probably not been formalized in the Asuka period. What this means is that the average Japanese emperor throughout the dynastic history of Japan had a personal name that was used prior to his becoming emperor. Then, as emperor, he was known simply as Tennoheika, His Majesty the Emperor. After his death, the era of his reign was given a name. It is this era name that is usually used to describe an emperor. For instance, the emperor who oversaw the modernization of Japan in the second half of the 19th century is known as Emperor Meiji. Meiji means enlightened rule. However, his personal name was Matsuhito. In most cases, the emperors are described according to their era name. Matsuhito, for instance, is nearly always described as the Emperor Meiji. There are exceptions which confuse the situation. For instance, in the Western world it has become commonplace to refer to Japan's emperor between 1926 and 1989 as Hirohito. But this is his personal name. His era or imperial name is Emperor Showa. Beyond rare exceptions like this, generally the name used to describe Japanese emperors and empresses is their posthumous era name. 710 AD is typically identified as the year that the Asuka period came to an end and the Nara period commenced in Japanese imperial history. The capital was moved to Nara, where a court that directly imitated fashions and patterns found at the Tang Dynasty court in China were adopted. This was known as the Heijo Palace at the time, and included a walled inner sanctum that became the imperial residence. Visitors to the site today will see full-scale reproductions of the palace's main buildings, but these are based on information obtained from excavations and are not the original structures. It was the Empress Gunmei who was responsible for this move to Heijo. Her objective in doing so was to create a new center of government where a large collection of buildings could be used to oversee a more effective government based on the newly promulgated Taiho Code. This was a set of laws which laid out both the social hierarchy within Japan based on the Chinese system and was also a political and legal code that framed how Japanese government was shaped for centuries to come. In this respect, the shift to Nara reflected the expanding power of the imperial government and the desire for greater control over Honshu and the other islands through more effective bureaucracy. There were 8 rulers of the Nara period down to 794 AD, including 3 more empresses. These oversaw a great expansion of the power of the imperial government. New provinces were created, and the court became a thriving center of early Japanese culture. Foundational Japanese texts like the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki were written down and distributed widely for the first time in the reigns of Gunmei and her immediate successors at Nara. The 8th ruler to reign at Nara was the Emperor Kanmu. He came to the throne in 781 and ruled down to 806, making his quarter of a century-long reign one of the longest recorded in Japan up to that time. As well as being the 8th and final ruler of the Nara period, Kanmu was the first emperor of the Heian period. In 794 he moved the capital again, this time from Nara to Heian-kyo. Heian means peace or tranquility, while Kyo means capital. Thus, the new capital's name was Capital of Peace. Today, we know it as Kyoto, which is basically a place name meaning capital city. Kanmu's reign and decisions were highly important for a multitude of reasons. Firstly, Kyoto became the traditional seat of the imperial government and would remain so for over 1,000 years. Even in the 21st century, Kyoto remains a symbolically important city within Japanese society. Secondly, he was the ruler who established the office of Sei Taishogun. This transliterates as the general that subdues the barbarians. The title was bestowed on Otomo no Otomaro in 794 for his actions in campaigning on behalf of the emperor against the Emishi people who controlled the northern end of the island of Honshu. The term Sei Taishogun evolved over time, and in the Western world today we know it as shogun. Otomo did not possess the kind of power that later shoguns would hold in Japan, but it is important that the title was created in the late 8th century at the same time that Kanmu moved the imperial government to Kyoto. The Heian period that began in 794 lasted for nearly 400 years and was, to a great extent, the golden age of the imperial dynastic system in Japan. The power of the imperial government expanded, and a unitary imperial system that exercised control over most of the archipelago came into being, although clans and groups in some of the outlying islands always maintained a lot of independence. This was also the era in which Japan's political culture and society became more confident and developed its own unique traits free of Chinese influences. The concept of a Chrysanthemum Throne that the emperors occupied emerged at this time too. We find reference to it in the 870s, although it's unclear if this was more of a rhetorical usage or if there was an actual throne decorated in imitation of the chrysanthemum flower at this point. If there was a real throne of this kind, it would have stood in the Heian Palace at Kyoto. This is not the palace that is located there today. The current imperial palace was built hundreds of years later, in the first half of the 14th century. The older imperial palace at Heian burned down in 1227. The site was subsequently built over, destroying a lot of archaeological evidence in the process that would have otherwise allowed archaeologists to reconstruct what it would have looked like more fully. There were 32 different emperors during the Heian period. This was a large number for a period of slightly under 400 years, meaning that the average reign of an emperor was only 12 years long. The reasons for the short average reign amongst the Heian period emperors was that it became commonplace for emperors to abdicate after a certain number of years on the throne. They would then enter a cloistered existence in Kyoto, but they continued to wield a lot of power over a younger emperor and the government as a kind of emperor emeritus. This system was also responsible for the evolution of the idea of emperors living out of sight of society, with only a small cohort of imperial staff having direct access to the ruler. There were additional political reasons for the evolution of this system during the Heian period. It allowed the emperors and the emeritus emperors to try to remain aloof from the clan system and the wider politics of Japan. Nevertheless, historians of Japan have long noted that the Fujiwara clan had already emerged by the start of the Heian period as one which held an inordinate amount of power within the imperial government. Members of the clan over the centuries monopolized the offices of Sesshu and Kampaku, which were the heads of the imperial staff and the chief minister within the government. Thus, while the Heian period was the golden age of the imperial system, there was already a dual power structure in place, whereby the emperors were the de facto rulers of Japan, but a powerful clan network were the most powerful group within Japan in real terms. This fluctuated over time across the Heian period, yet it established a template for how Japanese power would be distributed between the emperors and the more powerful clan leaders for hundreds of years to come. Japanese society changed enormously over the course of the Heian period. Firstly, a more unitary culture and society was created as imperial power expanded to conquer all of Honshu and most of the other main islands like Kyushu and Shikoku. The exception was Hokkaido, the second largest island of the archipelago in the far north. Despite several attempts to launch military campaigns here in the Heian period and later, Hokkaido maintained its own regional independence for centuries and was only fully brought under centralized Japanese control in the 19th century. The same situation prevailed across the Ryukyu Islands stretching from southwestern Japan towards Taiwan. An independent Ryukyu kingdom existed here down to the late 19th century. Elsewhere, across the lands which were ruled by the emperors, the samurai system became prevalent during the Heian period. Initially, this system was created to extend imperial rule by sending out imperial servants who would claim control over lands distant from Kyoto and govern them on behalf of the emperors. The system evolved and changed many times. For instance, the Western view of the samurai as a caste of military warriors is a misconception. In reality, the samurai system was built up to have multiple different layers to it. Some samurai were hereditary families of what we would call civil servants today. For example, they were frequently involved in tax collection or provincial administration on behalf of the emperors and held land in the provinces in return. In essence, it was a feudal system of decentralized governance in lieu of the imperial government in Kyoto being able to rule the distant provinces directly. By the 12th century, the power of the Heian emperors had declined greatly. The example of the Emperor Sutoku, one of the longest reigning emperors of the Heian period, is instructive. He occupied the Chrysanthemum Throne for 19 years between 1123 and 1142. The records of the era, though, describe a ruler more interested in religious rites, visiting various ceremonial sites around Japan, and ceremonial events at the imperial court. Instead, real power was now held by four powerful clans: the Fujiwara, the Minamoto, the Taira, and the Tachibana. In 1179, the head of the Taira, Taira no Kiyomori, seized control of the government in a coup. The Gunpei War followed between 1180 and 1185 as the Minamoto clan led a reaction to the Taira seizure of power. The Minamoto clan emerged with complete victory and established the Kamakura Shogunate in 1185. This was a military dictatorship, or bakufu, that ruled Japan from the city of Kamakura in central Honshu until 1333. It was the first time that the emperors in Kyoto were directly overshadowed by a shogun or military ruler. From this point onwards, for nearly 700 years, the emperors became symbolic, almost semi-mystical figurehead rulers of Japan, whereas real power was now held by the shoguns and the clan warlords. The Gunpei War and the establishment of the Kamakura Shogunate are typically viewed as marking the end of the Heian period and the classical period of Japanese imperial history. The period of Japanese imperial history that followed the Gunpei War is the most convoluted in the entire story of Japan's imperial system. In the middle of the conflict, the Emperor Go-Taba rose to the Chrysanthemum Throne. He was an infant at the time, and he abdicated in 1198. Later, as Emperor Emeritus, he attempted to restore the power of the emperors through the Jokyu War of 1221, an initiative which failed. Thereafter, the Shiken, the regent of the Kamakura shogun, became the most important political and military figure in Japan. For instance, it was the 8th Shiken Hojo Tokimune who led the defense of Japan against two invasions by the Mongols in 1274 and 1281. The emperor of the time, Go-Uda, played no real role in the campaign. Nonetheless, the earlier Jokyu War highlighted a desire within certain parts of the imperial system for the emperors to not be sidelined completely within Japan's politics. This impulse led to an imperial civil war in the 14th century. In 1333, Emperor Go-Daigo attempted to reassert imperial power once again in a movement known as the Kanmu Restoration. The Kanmu Restoration between 1333 and 1336 was the last time that a Japanese emperor would try to reassert control over Japan for 530 years. The resulting power struggle ultimately led to the end of the Kamakura Shogunate and the establishment of the new Ashikaga Shogunate led by Ashikaga and Tokugawa. While Emperor Go-Daigo failed in his attempt to re-establish the power of the emperors, the civil war of the mid-1330s led to a split in the imperial system as two rival candidates for the Chrysanthemum Throne emerged. Between 1336 and 1392, there were two rival imperial courts, the northern court at Kyoto and the southern court at Yoshino. For 56 years, two rival emperors claimed to be the true emperor of Japan. It was only following the renunciation of the claim to the throne by the southern court that the imperial struggle came to an end in 1392. Although the existence of two rival branches within the imperial succession existed in theory until 1911, when the Emperor Meiji issued a decree that the emperors of the southern court had been the legitimate emperors all along. The rivalry between the northern and southern courts echoed the growing anarchy of Japan in the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries. This was a time when the rulers of the various clans had become powerful daimyos, virtually independent regional lords who controlled various parts of Honshu and the other islands. In theory, the Ashikaga shogunate remained in existence until 1573, but in reality, civil war erupted in the 1450s and 1460s through incidents and clashes like the Onin War between 1467 and 1477. This period of anarchy became known as the Sengoku period or Warring States period. It prevailed for approximately 150 years and involved the rise and fall of numerous clan warlords who strove to acquire control over Japan's feudal politics. The arrival of the first Europeans to Japan in the 16th century and the spread of Christianity amongst the leadership of several of the clans complicated the politics of the time even further. The emperors, however, did not play a major role in the Sengoku period. They remained broadly aloof from society at Kyoto in the new imperial palace that had been built there in the middle of the 14th century. A notable exception occurred during the 1560s when the most powerful daimyo at that time, Oda Nobunaga, marched on and entered Kyoto as a means of symbolizing to the rest of Japan that he enjoyed the support of the Emperor Ogimachi. The Sengoku period only came to an end after 150 years in 1603, when Tokugawa Ieyasu established himself as the first ruler of the new Tokugawa Shogunate. Even then, resistance to his rule continued for many years before he and his son brought Japan firmly under the rule of the new shogunate and ended the anarchy. A campaign was also launched to drive the Europeans out of Japan and end the spread of Christianity. This closing off of Japan to Western influences characterized Tokugawa rule for the next 250 years. The shogunate they founded prevailed between 1603 and the Meiji Restoration 265 years later. The emperors were never more marginalized than during this era. There was a clear delineation of power under Tokugawa rule. The shoguns ruled the country in all practical senses from the city of Edo, modern-day Tokyo, while the emperors performed an entirely ceremonial role, living in seclusion in the imperial palace at Kyoto. Their position was as a kind of ceremonial and quasi-divine figure who performed a religious and moral role rather than having any say in the politics of the day. They did enjoy longer reigns, though, than their predecessors back in the Heian period and the classical era. The policy of ceremonial abdication had ended under the earlier shogunates, and from the early 14th century onwards there was a pronounced increase in the length of time which the Japanese emperors reigned for. For instance, between 1428 and 1629, just over 200 years, there were only 7 emperors, ruling for an average of nearly 30 years each. The imperial rulers of the Edo period or Tokugawa Shogunate did leave their mark on history to an extent. For instance, in 1627, a crisis occurred when Emperor Go-Mizuno bestowed purple robes on 10 priests. This had been specifically prohibited by the shogun as part of his attempt to acquire greater control over the religious life of Japan. The emperor and the imperial staff almost certainly knew what they were doing and engineered the purple robe incident as a way of testing the respective powers of the shogun and the emperor. The affair proved how limited the emperor's role in the government now was. Go-Mizuno, who was only a teenager when he had become emperor in 1611, eventually ended up abdicating in 1629 as he realized how powerless he was. He was succeeded by his 5-year-old daughter, the Empress Meisho. She was the penultimate empress of Japan. The final empress was Go Sakuramachi. Her reign between 1762 and 1771 was the last time a woman has ruled Japan, and the current constitution forbids female succession. 2 of her near successors, Emperor Kukaku and Emperor Ninko, ruled for over 66 years combined between 1779 and 1846. Their reigns were important in that the power of the Tokugawa shoguns was weakening during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. This provided an opportunity for a partial reassertion of imperial power. For instance, Kukaku's response to the Great Tenmei famine of the 1780s and the imperial court's organizing of relief aid should be viewed as an attempt by Kokaku to reassert the power of the emperors. He also displayed an interest in foreign policy during his long reign at a time when Russian activity in the North Pacific was creating unease about their intentions in the waters north of the Japanese archipelago. The Tokugawa shogunate overlapped with the rise, fall, and rise once again of European contact with Japan. Part of the reason for the disorder and division within Japan during the Sengoku period was that the first Europeans arrived at Japan in the middle of the 16th century as the civil wars were underway. The first to come were the Portuguese, who had found the sea route around Africa to Asia at the very end of the 15th century. Later, they were followed by Italian Roman Catholic missionaries, Spanish explorers, and even Dutch and English merchants and explorers by the early 17th century. The Portuguese, Spanish, and Italians were surprisingly successful in gaining converts to Christianity among some of the leading daimyos of Japan, and this added a new dimension to the civil wars. Once the Tokugawa shogunate was established, the shoguns began a severe program of persecution of Christian missionaries and attempted to crush the European influence in Japan. Apart from allowing a trickle of Portuguese and Dutch trade to take place through ports like Nagasaki, the Europeans were virtually locked out of Japan from the 1630s onwards. That isolation came to a striking end, though, in the summer of 1853, when an American naval expedition sailed into Tokyo harbor and fired off rounds of blank shots from their cannons. The implication was clear. The Western powers were back, and this time they were far more technologically advanced than they had been in the 17th century. Just over a decade earlier, the British had already seized control of Hong Kong Island during the First Anglo-Chinese War, a development which signaled the beginning of a new age in which the European powers began colonizing and taking over large parts of Southeast Asia, Oceania, and the Far East that had previously been beyond their grasp. Faced with this new threat, and as American, French, and British diplomats, traders, and businesspeople began arriving to Japan in the 1850s and 1860s, a wide-ranging debate began within Japanese society over how it should respond. If the Japanese did nothing, it was likely that they would fall victim to Western imperialism. But if they wanted to survive, they would have to adopt the methods of the Westerners and forego many elements of their traditional culture. This was the dilemma that faced Japan in the middle of the 19th century, one that would lead to a resurgence of the long-dormant power of the emperors. The question of whether Japan would modernize or try to continue to resist Western interference in its affairs came to a head in the first days of 1868, when a peculiar internal coup began. This was led by a number of powerful daimyos like Saigo Takamori, who seized control of the imperial palace at Kyoto on the 3rd of January. They then issued a proclamation that the Emperor Meiji would be reasserting control over the government of Japan after more than 2.5 centuries of rule by the Tokugawa Shogunate. The Boshin War broke out within weeks as the supporters of the old shogunate resisted the leaders of what became known as the Meiji Restoration. It lasted for 1.5 years and ended in imperial victory. Nonetheless, while this was portrayed as a restoration of imperial power, in reality, the Emperor Meiji was only a teenager at the time, and the real leaders of the restoration were a loose coalition of Japanese daimyos and political figures who had determined that Japan needed to modernize rapidly if it was to avoid the fate that was befalling so many other parts of Asia and Africa. France, for instance, had just annexed a large part of Indochina in its rapid colonization of this part of Southeast Asia. The Japanese did not want to be next. The Emperor Meiji may have only been 15 years old at the time of the Restoration, but he did grow up to play an influential role in Japanese affairs. At the same time, the new regime was shaped by Western influences. A modern Western-style cabinet was appointed to begin overseeing a process of rapid modernization. A Western-style bureaucracy and administration was set up too, while a new army provided with modern firearms and artillery was established, all moves which required the de facto dismantling of the traditional samurai system. The psychic shock of this rapid overhaul of Japan's traditional way of life was too much for many people, and even Saigo Takamori, a former leader of the Meiji Restoration, died leading the Satsuma Rebellion against the government in 1877. By then, Emperor Meiji's government was in regular contact with the governments of Britain, France, and the United States, and was absorbing everything that could be learned about industrialization, technology, science, and economics. Before the 1860s were finished, for instance, the Japanese Navy had acquired its first steel-clad warship from the French, and by the time of the Satsuma Rebellion, the Japanese military was operating with rifles and cannons. In 1889, the Meiji Constitution came into effect, and the following year, Japan became the first Asian nation to hold national elections to elect members to a national parliament. This was all in stark contrast to the continued inability of Korea and China to respond effectively to this growing contact with the West. Thus, in 1894, Japan was able to go to war with China and emerged victorious the following year in a conflict which left Japan in possession of Taiwan and also with increased influence over Korea. The position of Korea as a vassal of Japan increased in the years that followed, and in 1910, 2 years before the death of Emperor Meiji, the peninsula was directly annexed into the growing Empire of Japan. Japan's emergence as a formidable new power in the Far East was most dramatically seen in 1904 and 1905, when the nation went to war with the Russian Empire, as both nations were vying for influence in the coast region north of Korea in Manchuria. The Russo-Japanese War ended in a humiliating defeat for the Russians, and was the first time that an Asian power in the Far East had managed to repel an offensive European state in several hundred years. By then, the Japanese had already agreed to an alliance in the Far East with Britain, and it was this which brought Japan into the First World War on the 23rd of August 1914, while Japan ended up on the right side of the conflict. A worrying sign of future events was seen in January 1915, when the government issued the 21 Demands, through which the Japanese sought to acquire a vast array of powers and rights in China, notably through annexing the German port concessions there, but also in terms of influence over the development of a railway system in China and territorial concessions in Manchuria. Most of the more aggressive demands were never fulfilled, but it was a portent of future aggression. In the short term, under the new Emperor Taisho, Japan entered into a more liberal period in which the country's politics became more inclusive, and the country established closer ties to the victors of the First World War, Britain, France, and the United States. The Japanese were viewed at this time as a potential bulwark against the rise of communism in the Far East after the outbreak of the Chinese Civil War in 1927 and the earlier triumph of Bolshevik communism in the Soviet Union following the Russian Revolution of 1917. The accession of the Emperor Showa on Christmas Day 1926 was a significant event in the history of modern Japan. He had been serving as regent for his father, Emperor Taisho, for 5 years already at this point, but his formal accession at the end of 1926 marked a turning point in Japanese politics. In the late 1920s, a more militant foreign policy was adopted by the Japanese. In 1931, they occupied Manchuria and turned it into the puppet state of Manchu Kuo. 6 years later, a wider war with China commenced as the Empire of Japan attempted to become the dominant power in the Far East. This created tensions with the United States over influence in the Western Pacific, and the Americans soon reduced their supply of oil to the Japanese, a decision which was influential in the Japanese decision to attack Pearl Harbor in December 1941. The events that followed from that decision are well known. The US joined the other Allied powers, Britain, the Soviet Union, Canada, and other Commonwealth nations like Australia and New Zealand against the Japanese, Germans, and Italians, and the smaller Axis powers. 4 years of total war followed, in which the Empire of Japan briefly extended throughout large parts of China, Indochina, the East Indies, and various parts of the Pacific. Japanese troops, acting in the name of Hirohito, even raided into northeastern India and bombed Australia. In the end, though, the superior resources of the Allies eventually overpowered the Axis powers in Asia and Europe, and the Japanese were defeated in 1945. The role of Hirohito in all of this is very hard to gauge. There is absolutely no denying that there was a distinct change in Japan's entire foreign policy and government approach in the first years of his reign. Furthermore, Hirohito was the consistent figure in Japan's politics between his accession in 1926 and the end of the war in 1945. There were well over a dozen Japanese prime ministers during that same span of time. All of this suggests that Hirohito was the driving force behind Japan's increased militancy in the 1930s and descent into war, a war in which it committed a vast number of war crimes. On the other side of the argument, Japan had conquered and annexed Korea and various islands going back to the time of the Emperor Meiji, so developments under Hirohito could just be viewed as an intensification of a more long-standing imperialism that began in the late 19th century. Hirohito's legacy and actions are unclear and remain controversial. The question of Hirohito's role in Japan's aggression in the 1930s and 1940s is especially important because the end of the war did not signal the end of his reign. Although thousands of Japanese politicians, military commanders, and business people were charged with war crimes after the conflict ended, Hirohito remained as emperor, and any references to his possible complicity in Japanese war crimes were deliberately avoided in the war crimes tribunals after the war. What Hirohito was forced into was issuing the Humanity Decree on the 1st of January 1946. Through this declaration, he renounced the claim that the Japanese emperors had long upheld that they were divine beings. When a new Japanese constitution came into effect in 1947, it referred to the emperor as a symbol of the people of Japan, rather than being a divine ruler of any kind. Hence, the war and its aftermath brought about a fundamental revision of the understanding of the position of the Japanese emperors. Hirohito ultimately ruled down to 1989, making him the longest reigning emperor in Japanese history. He was succeeded by his son, Akihito, who reigned until his abdication in 2019. The current emperor, Naruhito, is the 126th imperial ruler of Japan, according to the traditional succession lists. But as we have seen, the earliest emperors were almost certainly mythological characters. Under the rule of Hirohito, Akihito, and Naruhito since the Second World War, the emperors have become more visible in Japanese life and have sought to modernize the imperial system. The current heir to the Chrysanthemum Throne is Naruhito's younger brother, Fumihito. Naruhito has a daughter named Aiko. Her presence in the imperial family has led to a debate in recent years about ending a stipulation that was introduced into the succession during the Meiji-era reforms that prohibited female succession. Thus, the succession is not set in stone, and there is a possibility that the constitution will be changed in years to come. Throughout its history, Japan has developed one of the most unusual and idiosyncratic dynastic and imperial systems to have appeared anywhere in the world. Most pre-modern societies were ruled at various stages by royal or imperial systems, be they kings, queens, emperors, empresses, or some other title. In the vast majority of these cases, there were concepts of ruling dynasties, families that ruled a kingdom or empire for decades or even centuries. Yet, in virtually all such cases, individual dynasties and families were believed to have ultimately become extinct when, for one reason or another, all the members of it died out or failed to produce any heirs. In these cases, the dynasty changed. Japan is different. It has had an unbroken chain of emperors since at least the middle of the first millennium AD. But it has not had ruling dynasties per se, although there is familial descent. Instead, Japan's history has been divided up into periods or eras rather than dynasties. Early on, these were defined by where the imperial capital was located. Later, they became centered more on wider political developments in Japan, as individual clans or shoguns rose to power. And herein lies the paradox of Japanese imperial history. Over time, the position of the emperors became diluted and was overshadowed. For centuries, the emperors resided in solitude and ceremony at Kyoto, while Japan's daimyos ruled the archipelago, ultimately resulting in the rise to power of the all-powerful Tokugawa Shogunate in the early 17th century. This is the situation which prevailed for 265 years, until the Meiji Restoration brought about a remarkable resurgence of imperial power, along with Japan's equally astonishing modernization. The Emperor Meiji and his two direct successors, Taisho and Showa, or Hirohito, were the three most important emperors in Japan's history. Ruling over a period of 122 years, during their time, Japan went from being a broadly medieval state through its rise as an authoritarian empire that caused the deaths of tens of millions of people in the Far East between 1937 and 1945, to become a peaceful technological economy that retained some of its ancient values. It is a testament to the resilience of tradition in Japan that the imperial system has survived through all of this. What do you think of the imperial history of Japan? Over the long duration, were the emperors substantially powerful individuals, or were the shoguns and the clan lords more important in the shaping of Japanese history? Please let us know in the comments section, and in the meantime, Thank you very much for watching.